edition of GreenTV. I'm your host, Kathleen Pettijohn. Tonight we present part 2 of our two-part series from the Agape International Spiritual Center in Culver City, California. Ladies and gentlemen, the conclusion of Noam Chomsky's speech on the war on Iraq.
The national security strategy said that the U.S. is intending to, the U.S. government is intending to rule the world by force. That's the dimension in which the U.S. has overwhelming advantages, but now it probably outspends the rest of the world combined in military force and is expanding it in directions that are considered extraordinarily dangerous by everyone, like moving into weaponry in outer space. It's not dominant in other dimensions, but in force, yes, overwhelmingly dominant. The U.S. intends to rule the world by force and to do it permanently. Any potential challenge that is detected to U.S. dominance will be destroyed. That's the content of the national security strategy. There's been nothing like that in history. Nobody's ever said that. They may think it, or they may describe policy that way, in fact have, but it's never been declared as official government policy before. There are precedents, and they're worth looking at, but nothing quite like this. Well, that frightened people, increased the fear that already existed. The fear was already great, increased it greatly. This is sometimes called a preemptive war doctrine. That's just propaganda. It's not a preemptive war doctrine. Preemptive war means something. A preemptive war, under charitable interpretations, falls within the existing framework of international law. Okay, so those of you whose memories are long enough may remember that the present incumbents in Washington, one of the ways they kept the country terrified through the 1980s, as they did, one of them was to conjure up an air base in Grenada, which the Russians were going to use to bomb us. Fortunately, our brave cowboy leader saved us in time, sent 6,000 special forces who managed to overcome the resistance of a couple of dozen Cuban paramilitary workers with pistols, and actually got 8,000 medals of honor for it. And we were standing tall after that, if you remember, so we were saved. But for a while it looked like the Russians were going to bomb us from Grenada, assuming they could find it on a map somewhere. Well, suppose they found it, and they had bombers there, and the bombers in Grenada were doing just what we were told they were going to do when everyone was supposed to be shivering. They were coming across the Caribbean to bomb Florida. Okay, if at that point the U.S. sent out planes to shoot down the bombers before they destroyed us, that would be legitimate under Article 51 of the UN Charter. That's preemptive war. This is something totally different. This is a doctrine that says we will attack anyone who we regard as a potential challenge. Nothing preemptive about that. Sometimes it's called preventive war, but that's not right either. It's not preventing anything. The only thing it's preventing is any potential challenge that the U.S. government invents, claims to be a challenge. That's just an open license to go to war with anybody and destroy anybody, which we can do because we have overwhelming power. And that's the way it's understood, and it doesn't make people comfortable. It did cause a wave of hatred and fear. I think this is the most feared and hated political leadership maybe in history. It's hard to think of a counterpart. Well, that's one thing that happened in September. Another thing that happened in September is that it was the opening of the midterm election campaign. September was the opening of the campaign for the congressional elections. Well, the Republicans understood very well that they can't possibly win the elections if the issues are those that concern people, socioeconomic issues, basically. And the reason is they're cutting everybody's throat, and they'll get smashed if that's the issue. So they had to do what they did right through the 1980s. Through the 1980s, their policies were extremely unpopular. They were able to stay in for good reasons. They were able to stay in office by frightening people, and that's what they did again. Karl Rove just was kind enough yesterday in the New York Times to explain it, although it was obvious before. It was necessary to frighten people into believing that there's a threat to their security. In that case, they'll rally around the strong leader, the brave cowboy, another one, and they'll suppress their concerns over things like, where's my job, or what's happening to my pension, or how am I going to take care of my elderly mother, and so on and so forth. If those issues if they're voting on those issues, the administration doesn't have a chance. And as Rove just pointed out yesterday, if they want to pursue their domestic agenda, a very harsh agenda, which would return the country back to 100 years ago. If they want to do that, they're going to have to frighten people, and that's correct. And they did. Starting in September, there was a drumbeat of propaganda about several things. First, that Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat to our survival, just like Grenada in 1983, an imminent threat to our survival. Another was the constant insinuation that he carried out or organized the September 11th attacks, and that they were planning new ones. Well, this was a spectacularly successful government media propaganda campaign. You can see it by looking at the polls. By the end of September and since, around 60% of the population believes that Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat to U.S. security and survival. By now, over a majority think that Iraq was behind September 11th and is planning new things, that Iraqis were on the plains. If you go back before that, it was like 3%, and the whole idea is totally outlandish. And furthermore, these attitudes, these beliefs, are very highly correlated with support for war, and it's understandable. I mean, if I believed those things, I'd be in favor of the war too. If you think that Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat to your existence, that he carried out the September 11th attacks, he's powerful enough to carry out new ones, yeah, there's an argument for war. And people in the United States are genuinely frightened. This is unique to the United States. No one else believes any of this. Even the neighboring countries that were attacked by Saddam Hussein is considered insane, But here it dominates. And this is not the first time that, it did work for the election, barely. If you take a look at the election, the Republicans managed to maintain power to pursue their domestic and international agendas by a very small number of votes, a couple of tens of thousands of votes. It was essentially a statistical tie, but just enough to maintain power. And they did it exactly this way. Polls show that people maintained their preferences, but suppressed their concerns over issues that matter in your life because they suppressed it below the security threat, so you rally around the leader. This is the story that went right through the 1980s. For these guys in office, it is absolutely second nature. They did come into office, as Blaise pointed out correctly and importantly, announcing a war on terror, which of course instantly became a major terrorist war. But they also started right off with threats to our existence. So in 1981, first year, the cowboy was hiding in the White House surrounded by tanks because Libyan hitmen were wandering the streets of Washington, going to assassinate our leader. Miraculous escape from that one. Then came Grenada. There were other Libyan threats. In fact, he told us told the country that Libya is trying to expel the United States from the world. They don't have small objectives. Then came Grenada, going to bomb us from Grenada, saved from that one. Then came Nicaragua, which was only 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. It was a cancer right in our landmass, as the moderate George Shultz, Secretary of State, put it and told Congress. We got to save ourselves. Furthermore, they're following the script from Mein Kampf, he said, planning to conquer the world. Reagan declared a national emergency in 1985 because of the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. You know, I mean, people outside the United States were looking in amazement as all this stuff was going on, but it worked. Kept the population frightened enough to keep them in office. And it went on right through the 80s. In 1988, George Bush was able to get elected by just pulling a straight race card. Willie Horton, you know, black criminal, was going to rape your sister unless I get elected. Hinted, you know, it wasn't said in those words, but it was so close to the surface you couldn't miss it. Crime, people were terrified about crime, they were terrified about drugs, one thing after another. These are all problems, but they're no different than any other industrial country. And the United States has a level of security that's just beyond what anybody can even dream of. But the population is a very frightened population. This goes way back. It's easy to scare people. Worked in the 80s. They're doing exactly the same thing now. And it did succeed in building up enough support so that even though opposition to the war is enormous, and in fact it's never been this hot, it was enough to sort of give them some kind of basis to go to war. That's an impressive achievement, and it also frightens people, you know, very much frightens them. I mean, today in the New York Times, you can, it's a big page showing pictures of Marines and others explaining why they want to go to war with Iraq and kill Iraqis. It's because they remember 9/11. Okay, now, you know, if somebody's watching this anywhere else in the world, they can only conclude one of two things. Either this country is so fanatically racist that if some Arab did something to you, you want to kill all Arabs. I mean, it's a level of racism that's pretty hard to imagine. Either that, or the country is so deeply indoctrinated that people believe what is pure, total nonsense. You can ask the editors of the New York Times which of those two messages they're trying to convey, but it's got to be one or the other. I can't think of a third interpretation. Okay, that frightens people. Let's go on. Congress in October did pass a resolution authorizing the government to use violence. I should stop. Yeah, okay. Pardon? Yeah, I'm going to, okay, one more minute and then I'll stop. No, she's right. They passed the I'll be like 1 minute, yeah. Passed the, you can ask questions, yeah, we'll go on with other stuff. They passed a resolution authorizing force because of the threat posed by Iraq to the security of the United States. Virtually the 1985 national emergency reiterated annually about Nicaragua. And it goes on from there. I mean, a lot of pretty awful things happened in the next month or two. My dear leader tells me I shouldn't go on to talk about them, but they're worth knowing about. One more minute. Let me just run through a few things that happened in October. I mean, these are things that were either not reported here or barely reported. You can figure out for yourself how much you read about them. In October, there was a retrospective meeting, the 40th anniversary meeting of the missile crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It was attended by key participants, high-level participants in the U.S., Russia, and Cuba. They knew at the time that it was a very dangerous period, the most dangerous moment in history. Kennedy's advisor, Arthur Schlesinger, described it as. What they found out last October just blew their minds. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from what would have been a terminal nuclear war. It was that close. Two Russian submarines were discovered. The Russian submarines had been under attack by U.S. destroyers the submarine commanders thought a war was on, meaning a nuclear war. They had nuclear-tipped missiles, and two of the commanders ordered them sent off, which would have led to a devastating nuclear response, wipe out Moscow. They respond by wiping out New York, and in a couple of minutes it's all over. The Eisenhower had warned even before that a nuclear war would destroy the Northern Hemisphere. It's not a joke. It was, why didn't it happen? Well, a third Russian submarine commander countermanded the order. That's why we're around to talk about it. It was that close. Furthermore, all of this is extremely timely. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the result of a campaign of international terrorism that the United States was waging in order to achieve what's now called regime change in Cuba. Same notions that are right in the headlines now. Quite a discovery. I mean, the fact that that isn't blaring headlines all over the place is pretty shocking. I don't think it was even reported here. You can check and see. Shortly after that, the UN passed two major resolutions, late October 23rd. One of them reaffirmed the 1925 treaty banning biological weapons. The second strengthened the Outer Space Treaty to ban emplacement of lethal weapons in outer space. Okay, those weren't reported at all in the United States, at least according to a database check done by a friend of mine. Why? The United States voted against them. It voted against a reaffirmation of the 1925 treaty banning biological weapons and against the treaty banning placing of weapons in outer space. U.S. alone voted against them. Israel voted with the U.S., but that's reflexive. It's like the Ukraine voting with Russia back in the old days. That's unilateral, therefore it doesn't get reported. Is that important these days? A treaty banning biological weapons or banning the placement of lethal weapons in outer space, which are likely to do us all in. Yeah, really important. Important enough so that the press understands that it's much better that citizens not know about this. Much too dangerous if they do know. And you don't unless you really go to exotic sources. Shortly after that, the Bush administration unilaterally terminated the negotiations on a treaty to put enforcement mechanisms into a bioweapons treaty. There is such a treaty, but has no enforcement procedures. The Europeans and others are trying to put in enforcement procedures. At the last minute, the Bush administration told them, you're not going to do it. And in fact, there won't be any more discussion of it for at least 4 years. It's the next thing that happened. Then we go on to the war. There's plenty, with that going on, there's plenty of background for the fear and the hatred, which is enormous. International polls are just shocking on this. I won't go through them because there's lack of time. They're mostly not reported, but they're dramatic. Well, again, going back to that observer from outer space, assuming that, I think outer space people are supposed to be male, so I'll call him him, assuming that he has some concern for the human species, he must be wondering with amazement how long a free people are going to allow this to go on. And the answer is not very long. No, let's go on.
You want to go for questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I
All right.
talk plenty. Yeah.
Okay. Join me again in thanking Noam Chomsky. Don't worry. We're going to have a few moments for questions. We have microphones on either side. Sorry. Please make your questions brief so that we have time. I think everybody here came to listen to Noam, so please make your questions direct and brief. I just want to remind you also that we do have to be out of the sanctuary at 5 o'clock. There's a service here, so let's keep it quick.
Okay, so there's two mics, one on each side.
Okay.
And we'll alternate.
Okay.
Hello, Noam. We'll take one question from each side.
Yeah.
This is a question here, Noam. One of those killed in the war was a Hopi woman from the Arizona reservation. For those who don't know, Hopi means people of peace or peaceful people. And I want to get your comments on why, after the U.S. Basically butchered the indigenous people, they continue to use their name as weapons of mass destruction. For example, the Apache, the Chinook, the Iroquois, Tomahawk, and so on. So if you could comment on that, no?
I mean, it's absolutely shocking. You know? I mean, it's as if the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was naming its planes Jew and Gypsy. You know? I mean, it's indescribable. You don't know how to talk about it. You know, how can a culture accept this? Naming your weapons of mass destruction after victims of genocide. You know, it's something that should really bother us a lot to write.
My question is, I've been talking to a lot of my friends and a lot of other people, and if I could characterize their emotion, I'd say that a lot of them feel kind of demoralized from some sort of feeling of failure, and I think that stems from the growing opposition that they saw prior to the war, and people that being expressed in terms of the biggest demonstration against the war ever, and then seeing the United States go to war anyway, and now kind of feeling that they've failed. And so, and also thinking that this war might be presented to the world as a huge humanitarian victory. They're going to let all the food in after they starve the people, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if there's something that I'm missing, or something we're missing from all this, that can turn that demoralization into inspiration and some sort of success.
There's something missing. And it's, in fact, there's a reason why nobody ever is allowed to look at history. If you take a little look at recent history, you'll see what's missing. There was an article in the New York Times, again, yesterday, asking, you know, what happened to the anti-war movement? It was so huge in the past. How come it's so small now? If you take a look at that article, the first date that it mentions is 1970, okay? And it says, oh, there was a fantastic anti-war movement in 1970. How come it's not like that now? What it didn't say is what happened before 1970. And it's not because the reporter is concealing it. She probably doesn't know. You're not allowed to know that when you go to school. What happened is that, and this is so little, you know, it's almost unknown, but it's a fact. The war began publicly in 1962. It was in 1962 that the Kennedy administration publicly announced, not secret, that the U.S. Air Force is bombing South Vietnam, authorized chemical warfare to destroy food crops, were beginning to drive millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps. That was after 7 years in which the U.S. client regime had killed maybe 70 or 80,000 people, and they couldn't control the population, so the U.S. went to direct aggression against South Vietnam. South Vietnam was always the main target of the attack. The rest of it was horrible enough, but it was peripheral. That's 1962. How much protest was there? Zero. You know, you literally couldn't get 2 or 3 people to talk about it in the living room. Protests didn't begin for years. I won't run through the story, but I mean, as late as 1966, early 1966 in Boston, a pretty liberal city, we literally could not have public protests against the war because they'd be physically broken up with the applause of the liberal press, by students, incidentally, marching over to smash them up. One of them in March 1966, we put in a church figuring that would be safe. No, it was attacked. The only reason it wasn't Arlington Street Church wasn't demolished was because there were a lot of police around. That's after 4 years of war. You know. By then, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed in South Vietnam. There had been, you know, saturation bombing of densely populated areas. The war had extended to North Vietnam for a year. Still couldn't protest it because there were nobody was protesting. You know, later it got to be a mass popular movement, and in fact an important one. By 1969, around 70% of the American population, regarded the war as, quoting from polls, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Incidentally, virtually no intellectuals. That's why you don't read that. What you read is it was a mistake. You know? But the population said, no, it wasn't a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. And furthermore, they kept that. People have kept that attitude right up to the most recent polls about a year ago, but not among the educated sectors. For them, it was a mistake. You know, it cost us too much. Benign intentions went awry, and so on. Enormous split between the public and the educated classes. Yeah, so there finally was massive protest. This time is quite different. There's massive protest long before the war even started. That's tremendous difference from 30 years ago. It's not the only difference. You know, the whole country became a lot more civilized in just about every respect you can think of. There was no women's movement back then. There was no environmental movement, you know, a couple of people maybe. There were no third world solidarity movements. There was no mass popular anti-nuclear movement. There was certainly no global justice movement. That's the last couple of years. There were no anti-sweatshop movements. I mean, just go across the board. All sorts of things have happened which have completely changed the country, including opposition to aggression and violence. And furthermore, the government is well aware of it. When the first Bush administration came in 1989, any incoming administration gets an intelligence review of the world situation. Well, usually it's secret. You know, maybe if you're lucky, you'll find out about it 40 years later. This one, a paragraph got leaked. It was barely reported, but it was very important, maybe because it was very important. And you should pay attention to it because it explains their thinking. It was about what the U.S. should do in a war against much weaker enemies. Okay? They're the only kind you get involved with for obvious reasons of prudence. It said in the case of a war against much weaker enemies, we must win rapidly and decisively because otherwise political support will collapse. It's understood to be thin. It's not the 1960s anymore, when you could go on and massacre people for years and years without any concern about opposition. Now you take a look at the interventions in the 90s, that's what it is. You want to intervene, you know, you first build up an image of some genocidal power going to destroy us or something or other, and then you win an amazing victory over a much weaker enemy decisively and rapidly, kind of what you're watching now. That's the only kind they can fight. That's an achievement. Now, these changes in the country did not, it's like the legacy I talked about before, they didn't come as a gift. You know, they came because people like you were out there in this working day after day to change the country. And it worked. It's a different country, a much better one. There are also efforts to drive it back. You know, guys with power don't like this. So of course they're not going to give up. They continue to fight their own war to drive it back. And if people who are concerned about these things give up, they'll win. Those who feel depressed about what just happened just don't understand. It's a major achievement, what happened. Not enough to have stopped this war, but totally different from in the past. That's